So in terms of our objectives, really, again, want to cover the opioid epidemic, and in particular how it affects the African American community, as well as some other substances. Also look at some of the statistics around the epidemic. Really want to kind of illuminate the whole issue of stigma and substance use disorder, as well as the opioid epidemic, and the journey of faith and how that basically has transformed not only my life, but the life of others in terms of our recovery journey through the 12 steps, as well as through church. And so that is the objectives that we hope to complete before the end of this discussion. Everybody with me? Okay, so let's just look at this picture. Everybody knows who he is.
Yeah.
Most of us love him. He's one of my favorite people. So I just kind of want to cue everyone and kind of get a sense of your favorite Prince record. So if you could just sort of put in the chat your favorite Prince record, and I'll let you know ultimately what is my favorite Prince record. So go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll just wait for a couple of minutes for everybody to give us your favorite Prince record. Okay, we seeing anything in the chat?
We are Diamonds and Pearls, Little Red Corvette, Purple Rain, Purple Rain, Purple Rain, Diamonds and Pearls, Purple Rain, When the Doves Cry. I think Purple Rain won. It's like 5 Purple Rain. It's Little Red Corvette. Freedom, Raspberry Beret. I love Raspberry Beret.
Fantastic. So it looks like Purple Rain has it. It's also my absolute favorite record. If you go back to when this record first came out, you can actually hear it in the background. Yes, Prince was phenomenal. Prince was great. Prince was insightful, and one of my heroes. So why am I talking about Prince? Unfortunately, we lost Prince. We lost Prince to an opioid overdose death. And many people are saying, well, he probably caused it himself. He was a drug abuser. So, that's just how it is. But when we talk about substance use, particularly opioids, so Prince was one of those individuals, I went to see him 2 or 3 times, where he did a lot of sort of physical kinds of stage performances. He did these magnificent splits. He would turn, he would jump up on top of his piano, then jump down. When he jumped down, he did these magnificent splits. So what happened as a result of that? As Prince got older, he then began to experience a lot of pain. He experienced pain where he had to have a hip surgery. He experienced pain from his lower back. And so almost his whole body in terms of his bone structure really became diseased. And as a result of that, the secret that Prince had is that he started on opioids, particularly Percocets, but also the deadly drug, synthetic drug called fentanyl. And over time, that's what really made Prince become addicted. And so I say that to say that anyone can become addicted. Anyone can go into the hospital or have some procedure done with the best of intentions and come out a person who was addicted. Unfortunately, Prince died as a result of that. So when we talk about the opioid crisis, the president several years ago considered the opioid epidemic as an emergency. And so resources were actually given to communities. And the biggest thing is that the attitudes around addiction changed, or substance use disorder. And it became more of an empathetic kind of response because opioids affected white, middle-class, rural individuals. Responses became more focused on treatment. And just the discourse and conversation changed nationally. But in that conversation, one group was left out, or several groups were left out. And one of those groups were African American. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. So as we look at addiction across the lifespan and see how it impacts multiple kinds of individuals, I want to just ask you to close your eyes for a moment. Everyone that's within the sound of my voice, just close your eyes for a moment. I want you to listen to these rather startling statistics in terms of the opioid epidemic and substance use disorder. So firstly, just imagine this. Almost 49 million Americans have used illicit drugs. 49 million Americans. Think about that number. Secondly, 70% of more than 67,000 drug overdoses in 2018 involved opioids. Third, 2/3 of all overdose deaths involved synthetics, particularly drugs like fentanyl, carfentanil. Fourth, opioids were involved in almost 47,000 overdose deaths in 2018. Next, in 2017, 38,226 new HIV diagnosis was transmitted as a result of intravenous drug use directly associated with opioids. And in my own state of Georgia, where I've lived for the last 25 years, over 60% of drug overdose deaths involved opioids. And in 2018, we in Georgia had 866 deaths. Please, everyone, open your eyes. Having said that, this epidemic is of an emergent nature. And so as we move forward in the presentation, please sort of look at this through this lens of just how serious this disease is. So when we look at this particular slide, addiction across the lifespan, we really just want to look at the individuals that it impacts. So we've got pregnant women. So pregnant women who use opioids oftentimes deliver babies that are withdrawing from opioids. And we'll talk a little bit about that, calling it neonatal abstinence syndrome. And so as a respiratory therapist, when you look at this next picture, you'll see this little baby. We take care of these babies all the time. My specialty is pediatrics. And so these babies that are born withdrawing from opioids become very irritable. They become very difficult to manage, very difficult to soothe. Oftentimes in the withdrawal process, they have to have respiratory support. So oftentimes these are the ones, babies that go on ventilators and so forth. And so it really does impact not just the mother, but also the baby. Also, it impacts family, it impacts children. Those children whose parents are addicted don't get the caring, don't get the love oftentimes that they deserve. And as you look at the rest of these, you'll see populations that you might not even expect would be addicted to opioids, and particularly senior citizens, sort of the silent population that oftentimes gets overlooked, and the discussion does not focus on their needs. But they're the ones that have these surgeries. They're the ones that, like Prince, oftentimes are unaware of the dangers of opioids, and then find themselves at, in their senior years as addicted to opioids. So in the next slide, just in terms of what are opioids? Basically, again, opioids are used to treat pain. This is what they were initially used for: pain following surgery, pain following, for example, when we place individuals, patients on mechanical ventilators, oftentimes we have to give them opioids just so they'll be able to tolerate being on mechanical ventilators. Here's the problem. So early on, physicians were told by the pharmaceutical companies that opioids were not addictive. So they really pushed this. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides, how this whole sort of projection of opioids happened. But one of the things that people found themselves doing is taking more and more opioids, being prescribed sometimes 90 days of opioids for a dental procedure, for example, and ultimately coming down with the addiction. Here is the problem. Anyone who takes prescription opioids can become addicted to them. So actually, 1 in 4 patients who receive long-term opioids actually become addicted. That is quite a large number, particularly when we were told early on that opioids are not addictive. So in this next slide, let's just look at just some of the more popular opioids. You can see we've got oxycodone, and by a long shot, Oxycontin is the most popular opioid and the most used opioids. And of course, you got hydrocodone, morphine, methadone, codeine, Percocet, and that's what Prince succumbed to. But here is the problem. Here is where we are getting into trouble. That's with these synthetic drugs. So these drugs like fentanyl, carfentanil, are now being mixed with almost every drug that you can think of, and that's what's killing people. So just to put this in perspective, fentanyl is 1,000 times more potent than morphine. Carfentanil is an analog of fentanyl. And let's just put this in perspective. Carfentanil is actually used as an elephant tranquilizer, a large animal tranquilizer, and it is 10,000 times more potent than morphine. It's very, very potent, such that when first responders come upon a drug overdose, they have got to really, really protect themselves, because 1 grain of carfentanil can actually cause an overdose, not just for the individual who's overdosed, but also first responders must protect themselves. So as a respiratory therapist, again, we're in the emergency room. We are the ones that receive the patients that have overdose. Or sometimes they're intubated or they have a tube in their lungs out in the field, but oftentimes it's in the emergency department. And so as we receive these patients that come into our emergency department, we have to be very, very careful just in terms of making sure that we're not exposed to the drug as well. And of course, we'll see in the next couple of slides that as opioid users became addicted and opioids became more unaffordable, they then turned to heroin. And we'll see that surge in 3 different phases in the next upcoming slides. So the other thing, and I wanted to put this in, just put this in the back of our mind, because we're dealing with some very dangerous drugs, very, very dangerous drugs. And this one drug here is called Great Death. This is the scariest thing I've ever seen. This actually is a combination, oftentimes it's a combination of many different drugs. But for the most part, it's a combination of fentanyl and carfentanil, all combined together. And it is even more dangerous than carfentanil, but it's on our streets, and it's on our streets mainly in the Southeast. In some other areas, but mainly in the Southeast. But this is probably one of the scariest drugs that you will ever see, this Great Death. And so we really just want to keep that in mind. So when we talk about addiction, and so when I use the term addiction, I'm referring to addiction as the disease. I don't refer to other individuals as addicts. And we'll talk a little bit about a changing language also helps us to better address a substance use from a more empathetic and from a more respectful stance. But overall, when we talk about addiction, in terms of the definition, it's a chronic relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite its harmful effects. So let's just put this in context. So one can use drugs, they can use them for years and years, and they can, oftentimes not become addicted. An individual, on the other hand, can rarely use drugs. Let's just say you're a weekend warrior and you just do drugs on the weekend. The problem with addiction is not so much how much you use or what drugs you use. The problem with addiction is what happens after you use drugs. So if after I used Percocet, after I used hydrocodone or some other drug, I get in my car, I drive, then I run into a family and somebody in the accident gets killed. I'm constantly not paying my bills. I'm constantly, my personality changes. Those are the sort of the consequences that we're talking about that makes one an addict. Not how much drugs you've used and not what drugs you use. Although many drugs don't take a long time for individuals to become addicted. And there's a lot of factors. Some, I believe a part of it's hereditary, but nevertheless, again, we must look at the consequences in terms of addiction. So let's just look at this particular graph here. And I talked about the 3 waves of the addiction. So when you look at this, if everybody can see it, the first wave really was the overprescribing of drugs. And you see that in this purple graph. So between 1999 up to 2016, you'll see this increased projection, increased prescription, increased prescribing. So that's the first wave. The second wave is the rise in heroin overdose death. So remember I told you, as the addiction progresses from prescription opioids and the transition to illegal heroin use, that happened in 2010. So when you look at this increase in, this is the orange line, where you see in 2010, it increased dramatically in terms of opioid use. Heroin use. And in the third wave, which is this blue, where you see wave 3, this is the rise in synthetic overdose death. So this is when drug dealers began to mix heroin, mix opioids, mixed marijuana, mixed almost any drug with these synthetic drugs like fentanyl and carfentanil. And this is where we got in trouble. This is where the overdose deaths happen, because oftentimes users don't know that their drugs have been mixed with heroin. And a lot of people say, well, why would drug dealers want to, taint their market? Why would they want to kill their prospective clients? Well, the thing is, particularly with carfentanil and fentanyl, these drugs are very, very sensitive. They're hard to really measure on a typical measuring scale. So oftentimes, while maybe not intended, drug dealers actually put more in their supply than they should, which is what causes the overdose deaths. So in this next slide, just wanted to kind of put this in perspective, because oftentimes what happens is that when we talk about opioid use, we've got to talk about polysubstance use. Most of the individuals that come into our emergency departments that are in our syndromic surveillance actually are using not just one drug, but multiple drugs. So when you look at this particular slide, you'll see marijuana overall is the most used. Secondly, you'll see prescription pain misuse is the second in terms of illicit drug use. And this goes down the line to stimulant use, cocaine, so forth. And so this just sort of puts it in perspective in terms of the magnitude of substance use disorder. So in this next slide, looking at illicit drug use among African Americans. And so what has happened in this opioid epidemic, the conversation basically has been about white middle class, particularly men. And the use in the African American community has slowly been rising. But there's no conversation around this from a national perspective. We have to understand that in many communities, Washington, D.C. has an explosion of opioid use among African Americans, as well as Chicago. These are the places, but we're not hearing about it. And we really have to demand surveillance that really includes race as a factor, so that we'll know what's happening in our community. So let's just look in terms of the body effects of opioids. These are things that, as a respiratory therapist, I'm always seeing and treating in our intensive care unit. So there are three areas of impact here: cardiovascular, the brain, and also neuro. And so in terms of cardiovascular, you can see for the most part the cardiovascular effects: tachycardia, we call it, increased heart work, impact on blood pressure. When an individual has taken an overdose, the first thing that's impacted is the respiratory system. So individuals are unable to breathe adequately to sustain oxygenation. And so that's when we have to intubate these patients and put them on some kind of life support. And again, other things like decrease or increase hypertension, as I mentioned earlier. The other impact is on the brain. So this is important because In the past, addiction was looked at as a moral deficiency. So, in other words, these individuals who were addicted to drugs, they did it on their own. It's their fault. I don't have a whole lot of empathy for them. Once an addict, always an addict. So I really don't want to be, but just put them in jail. That's been the attitude. But what we've always known, but really haven't sort of espoused this, is that in actuality, substance use disorder and addiction actually is a brain disease. The actual structure of the brain has changed, and it will never go back to being the same. Oftentimes what we are hearing is that there's a lack of glucose metabolism in the orbital frontal cortex, and that is the area where we'll see this change in the brain structure, which actually now looks at addiction as a disease as opposed to some kind of moral deficiency. And that really reframes how we treat these individuals, reframe our attitudes around these individuals. And this really became salient as a result of the opioid epidemic in the white community, becoming more an empathetic kind of response, more of a treatment-oriented response, and a response where we really want to help these individuals as opposed to just locking them up and putting them in jail. The other thing I want to just bring up is the impact on our infants. Now, I told you about just taking care of these infants that are born addicted to opioids. And one of the things that is very, very salient now, and this is the neonatal abstinence syndrome. And that's what this disease is called. And we have, again, individual infants that are born addicted to opioids, and we have to treat them accordingly. And it's really a sad situation because, again, when you see that tube is what goes directly into the lungs, and on the other side of that tube is a mechanical ventilator. It's very, very deleterious for the infant, but part of the problem is that many of these infants have lifelong chronic lung disease as a result of this neonatal abstinence syndrome. Moving right on along. So again, I just wanted to kind of frame this in terms of what happens when individuals come into the emergency department. So as a respiratory therapist, this is probably a respiratory therapist here, and you'll see that the individual is actually ventilating this patient because the patient's overdosed and has not been able to breathe on their own. One of the first things that we do is give the life-saving drug called naloxone. This is a drug that actually reverses the overdose effect. So in other words, giving this drug to a person who is listless, appears to be dead, naloxone can either be given in a nasal spray or can be given as an injection, but this literally brings the person back to life. Problem is, it's not always accessible. And another problem is it is very expensive. So part of our goals in terms of community engagement is to be able to make this available in our communities, because again, naloxone is life-saving. And so again, in this next picture, you'll see here that individual, if naloxone is unsuccessful, we then have to put this patient on a mechanical ventilator and place a tube in their mouth all the way into their lungs and put them on mechanical ventilator. So kind of want to just stop for a moment and get perspective in terms of stigma. Because again, most of what's been happening in the past in terms of African American men particularly, the response has been incarceration. And we've had several of our leaders who have perpetuated this process. So from Nixon to Reagan to Clinton waged a war on drug abuse in this country, and they developed policies that really were disadvantaged in terms of how they were actually done in our communities. But these policies impacted individuals with small amounts of drugs. Basically were locked up. This 3 strikes and you're out was one example. And as a result of that, and as a result of them having these felonies, oftentimes had their voting rights taken away from them. Coming out of jail, unable to find jobs because of them having a felony. Oftentimes public housing is not available to these individuals. And I think most importantly, the impact on the entire family of having a person, particularly if they're the breadwinner, taken away from that family dynamic and just really putting the family in disarray. But most importantly, we have a broken probation system. So oftentimes, even when these individuals have served their time and they have come back into society, they're in these very stringent probationary rules and regulation where the most minor of infraction can cause them to go right back into prison. So these are some of the things that we as a community have to address in terms of changing the way we respond in the African American community to substance use disorder. And so just kind of putting this in perspective, looking at America. America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. And quite frankly, the second country, which is Russia, is fairly far behind us. So there's a problem with that. There is something that we have to do in order to be able to address the magnitude, particularly of Black men that are incarcerated for minor nonviolent offenses, most of which are drug related. And so again, in talking about the war on drugs, African Americans are 6 to 10 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Drug offenses account for 2/3 of the rise, particularly in the federal inmate population. And again, more than half of young Black men in large cities, now we're talking about half of men in large metropolitan cities are either directly or indirectly under the criminal justice system, and many of them, most of them are for minor drug offenses. And again, particularly Washington, D.C. is impacted in terms of the opioid epidemic, and we're really not hearing about this on the national scale. And when we look at how opioids and substance use is impacting our community, this has to be brought to the forefront so that appropriate resources can be used in terms of treatment and recovery. One of the things that I just think is should be a read for everyone. And this young lady just addresses this whole criminal justice response in African American community, and it's still in place. It's many of our young men are still behind bars.
Michelle.
I'm sorry, somebody say something?
Oh, that's Michelle.
Oh, okay. So I'm sorry. Yeah. So the new Jim Crow, this particular book is phenomenal. If you get a chance to read it, I tell you, you will never be the same. I think every African American should read this, but not only African Americans, but our community should be aware of how she really addressed very specifically what is happening in terms of the criminal justice system. So, want to kind of just change course for a moment and really look at my own personal journey. So, again, nobody really wakes up in the morning and say, I want to become a drug addict. Nobody does that. It's a set of things that happen. Uh, Under some circumstances is a choice. Under other circumstances, as you've seen with Prince and others like Michael Jackson, it wasn't a choice. I want to share my own journey because, sure, I have a PhD. Sure, I have I have all of these degrees. I have all this professional experience. But what really informs my journey more than anything else is my personal experience of drug addiction. And so I always tell people that of all of the things that happened to me in my life, the addiction, the catastrophic kinds of things that happened to me, some of the most devastating things in my life, nothing was more devastating for me than a broken heart. And this is what started my journey into what I call the dungeon of disgrace. And so I was in a relationship, and as a result of this relationship, I've never been in a position where I've not been able to cope with emotional pain, but I found myself at this place back in the 80s. And it was so sort of like incapacitating that I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to cope. And so I was in so much pain. I started drinking more. That didn't seem to help. I started not being able to even go to work. I was in such a deep, deep depression. And again, I didn't know how to actually get out of it. What I know today in reflecting, I really was having a part nervous breakdown. It really was. And it never occurred to me that I should seek psychological help or anything like that. All I knew is I would do anything to get out of the pain that I was in. And back then in the 80s, we were told cocaine is not addictive. It is something that and I was living in Los Angeles at this time. So that message was really, really salient. And so I found myself just in so much pain that I would have done anything to get out of it, anything. That's the first time in my life I even contemplated suicide. That was just something, that was never in my consciousness. But the pain that I was going through was just so stifling that I just didn't know what to do. So then I started sort of sampling cocaine and different drugs. And as I got more into it, I found out a couple of things. Number one, it was taking that pain away. It was taking that pain away. And by the time that it took that particular pain away, I then had another pain. And for me, it didn't take long for me to become totally addicted. And so the addiction became so devastating for me in Los Angeles, California, that subsequently I became homeless. Subsequently, I was sleeping in abandoned homes. And on most nights in West Hollywood, Los Angeles, California, my home was in a park. And I had this bag, and in the bag was a pillow and it was a blanket. And I would carry that with me every night. And I would actually and literally sleep under bushes every night. And even when it rained. And I tell you, there's just no greater pain than the fear of not having a home, not having some place to go, not having the safety of a home. And then, and I just want to share this with you because this really has some pretty significant implications for my life. And so one day, as I, of course, was getting high and drinking and so forth and so on, and I was coming from a bar. And when I came out of this bar, got in my car, an individual asked me if I could give him a ride. So I said, sure. And when I gave him a ride, all of a sudden I found this gun to my head. And of course, I had been drinking. It didn't even occur to me to just, kind of do what he said to do. My first instinct was fight or flight. So we had this death duel in the car, which, kind of, resulted in outside of the car, but the gun went off. And initially when the gun went off, I just thought the bullet had gone into the air because I didn't feel a thing. And when the gun went off, because I had taken the gun away from him, that was my goal, and that's what happened. And as the guy was running away, I had this gun in my hand, and I had on a red shirt. So there was no blood or anything, but I started to feel very lightheaded. And all of a sudden, someone walked past me and said, "Mister, you have been shot." And immediately, that sort of went through my whole body. I started to become lightheaded, and I think I may even passed out temporarily. But the next thing I knew is that I was in the emergency room of a hospital, and I was semi-conscious, and I heard the doctors say, "Take him immediately to the emergency room because he's bleeding." But I remember saying this prayer. And this prayer was, "God, please get me out of this. Please don't let me die like this." And I tell you, no lie, the moment that I said that prayer, the next thing I heard the doctor say is, "Stop. The bleeding has stopped. We don't need to take him to the operating room. And all we need to do is to address his collapsed lung," because the bullet had collapsed my lung. But here's the miracle. That bullet had gone through my entire body, and it had landed right next to my spine. And the doctor said to me, he said, "Sir, this is a miracle, because if that bullet had have been lodged just a centimeter more to the left, you would be in a wheelchair, if you would be alive at all." So that had grave implications for my whole being, for my whole consciousness. But that didn't stop me from using drugs. It would take me, after that incident, 10 more years before I would actually become totally free of substances. And so I say that because that had grave implications for my life later on in me getting clean. But fast forward, through many other kind of devastating kinds of things that happened to me, in 1991, the light went off. And so I found myself, after I had gone through 8 or 9 rehabs before that, none of them ever worked. The only thing that ever worked for me is going to a 12-step program. And I sat there and I watched these other people. Many of them I had known from my addiction of being on the street. But these people just there was something different about these people. Number one, they weren't using drugs. They weren't using, and many of them hadn't been using drugs for years. And so finally the light went off, and I surrendered to a 12-step program. And as a result of that, on August of 2019, I celebrated 28 years of continuous clean time. And that would not have been possible were it not for a 12-step journey. So I just want to briefly talk a little bit about this, this freedom and this my ability to be able to be totally transformed through the 12-step process. And so when we talk about 12 steps, so I don't really align myself with any particular 12-step program. I just in generally want to talk about the 12-step because I want to respect the autonomy and the principles, of these 12-step programs in terms of their autonomy. But this is my journey, and my journey of freedom is through the 12 steps. So overall, most 12-step programs are nonprofit fellowships of men and women for whom drugs have become a major problem. They are all recovering persons who meet regularly to help each other stay clean. There are no strings attached. These organizations are not aligned or associated with any other organization. They're totally autonomous. And I think the thing that was most inviting for me and most powerful is this last one. And we say this at all of our meetings. Anyone may join us, regardless of age, race, sexual identity, creed, religion, or lack of religion. I never have been a part of an organization that invited individuals just as they are, and being very, very inclusive, particularly around the issue of sexual orientation, because I never thought as a Black gay man that there would be an institution that would totally accept me as I am, particularly with the way that the program unfolds and having to really, really strip down in terms of one's internal kinds of issues and life histories, and being able to cleanse oneself from the inside. Just didn't think that was possible. And I tried I tried the church, I tried many other places, but just never really was able to experience the kind of freedom that I did in the 12 steps. So here are the 12 steps. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are several that were most compelling and most transformative for myself. Number one is that we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. This was the clincher. This was the thing where one had to go inside and totally from your deepest level admit that you are addicted and that you no longer have control over your addiction. And once that can be internalized and lived out, we oftentimes say, with this acceptance, we are well on our way. One of the other most powerful ones is the third step. And while 12-step programs are not religious programs by any means, these are spiritual programs, but they oftentimes incorporate religious principles. This third one, we made a decision to turn our will and life over to the care of God as we understand him or understood him. And so many people have an issue just with the word God. And so what we say is, it's whatever your higher power is. It's whatever your concept of God is, whether it's Muslim, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Church of God in Christ, whatever it is, it's totally up to you, as long as it is caring and love. But what we do is become dependent on that power to really help guide our life. That's in the third step. One of the next powerful steps for me was the fourth step. This is literally going back into your life and writing out your whole life history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And when we look at our lives, I don't care who we are, everything is just not ugly. Everything is just not about the addiction. It incorporates a multitude of things. And the other thing is that we oftentimes suggest a sponsor. That's someone who we respect, someone that we want to help guide us, a mentor, if you will. And it is this person that helps guide you through these steps because they've already been through it. And they take you through your entire life with this fourth step. And they sort of look at patterns. They look at ways where you've contributed to your own demise, but they also look at the light that oftentimes have been overshadowed by addiction. to let you know, to let us know that behind every dark cloud, there's always a light. And that was one of the most freeing and transformative experiences I've ever had in that fourth step. And the last step, actually the 11th and 12th step. So the 11th step for me is an ongoing process of continuous spiritual growth. It says we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will and the power to carry that out. So what that is saying is, whatever your spiritual persuasion is or religious persuasion, that needs to be continually built upon. It's not a static process. This is an ongoing, very fluid kind of process where you're constantly seeking spiritual awareness and spiritual development. And the last one, I think, is probably the most important one. This is our 12th step. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry our message to addicts and to practice these principles in all of our faith. So we then have a responsibility, a personal responsibility to help others who come through the same pathway that we've come through. And so it's very, very important that the freedom that we've gotten over the years through the 12 steps, we then allow and guide other individuals so that they can receive the same kind of freedom. And so having said that, things have changed. Because of COVID-19, we're no longer able to meet physically face-to-face. All of our meetings, or most of our meetings now, are via Zoom. So there's good to that, there's bad to that. A lot of our newcomers has not had the opportunity to really physically see what goes on at our meetings, at our conventions, those kinds of things. That's lost in a Zoom meeting. And it's really challenging. And we, as old timers, have really had to be more focused and more diligent in really helping newcomers come into this process, because we didn't come in through Zoom, but now we're being forced to have all of our meetings, conventions, so forth, through Zoom. But here's the good news. There is an expansion that has happened that we never would imagine. So there are meetings now with people all over the world, where basically we would just have meetings like here in Atlanta. That's most of the time I'm at meetings in Atlanta. Now I get to do meetings in London, meetings in Africa, meetings all over the world. And it just has taken us on a whole nother kind of level of just spirituality and really getting to know a whole different populations that we don't really get to hear and know unless we have a world convention. And so, that's part of my 12-step journey. But the things that is most compelling here is that through this freedom, through these 12 steps, lost dreams are awakened and infinite possibilities arise. And the kind of principles that we then carry on, particularly in our 12 step and through these 12 steps, principles like faith, belief, hope, trust, love. These are then the guiding sort of forces and factors that inform our life moving forward. How am I coming along for time?
You are good. The break starts at 10:30, so you have about 30 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. So, so here's the miracle. When we talk about lost dreams are awakened, this is myself, along with three of my colleagues, in 2008, when I graduated from the University of Georgia with my doctorate in adult education. And what I realized today is recovery and the 12 steps afforded me that journey. One of the first things that happened in terms of the 12 steps was I understood that whenever you give up one addiction, oftentimes it needs to be replaced with something. So one of the things, and even through my addiction a lot of the time, I've always been an avid workout person, and I'm a gym rat. my name. And so that really became an integral part of my life, exercise. And when we look at recovery programs and interventions, particularly for the African American communities, new programs really do focus on exercise as an integral and important part of our recovery journey, and just replacing those negative kinds of addictive kinds of things with positive things. And as we always say, oftentimes in our recovery meetings, we really do have to change our way of thinking. Okay, and this has been a way that I've been able to replace that addiction with more positive things. But the other thing was education. Early on, in my first year of recovery, because I was so addicted that I couldn't keep a dime in my pocket. So I literally had to go on welfare. 1990, I think it was 89 or 90. And sporadically I would work throughout my addiction. One thing, as a respiratory therapy, I never had to worry about work. I could do work, day work, and still get paid. So I really sort of, in terms of economics, I pretty much was able to afford my addiction. But in that first year, I just decided no work, nothing. All I'm going to do is go to meetings. I'm going to sort of enmesh myself into the recovery process. And that worked. That worked for me. But the thing that was most important was the fact that, I changed my whole sort of attitude, people that I hung out with. So even throughout the years, 90% of all of my friends and associates are all in recovery, 90%, still today. And some of the people that I met early on in recovery are still my friends today. So I have these 28, 29, 30-year-old relationships that are very, very solid. And again, they are relationships that I cherish today. And my recovery journey, by the way, actually started in terms of my clean time. I got clean in 1991 in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. That's where I'm from. That's where my first year of recovery was sort of nurtured in Philadelphia, and so I'm forever grateful for them for that process. But here's what I found out. I was probably one of the first here in Atlanta to really graduate with a doctoral degree within my circles in the meetings that I went to. And this was sort of unheard of, but what it did, it opened the floodgates. It opened the doors for other individuals within our fellowship to go on and get different degrees. Many of them have masters. They're going back to get their bachelors. They're going back to get their, doctoral degree. Many individuals now have come to me and said, how'd you do it? What can I do in order to achieve that? And many of them have gone on to get their doctoral degree. And so I say that to say, now I realize today that this whole journey was not just about me. Matter of fact, it was very little about me. This whole journey, the pain, the shooting, that time that bullet went through my body, it wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. But it was to know, and the thing that really was so important about that particular situation is I knew there was somebody that was watching over me to guide that bullet through my body like that. And I still have the scars on my chest and on my back where they took that bullet out that was just lodged against the skin of my back. But it let me know that there was somebody watching, something watching over me. Couldn't sort of operationalize it at that time, but in my deepest heart, I knew that somebody had my back, regardless of what other people thought. And when I got to Atlanta, I went to different churches, and I never will forget this one church that I went to. I'm not going to say the name of the church, but it's probably one of the worst experiences that I've ever had, because the entire sermon was about how much gay people were an abomination to the human species, and just how much that they've degraded the African American community, and particularly African American structure. And I was in such pain when I went there, because I was new to Atlanta and I wanted to find some kind of spiritual sort of institution, place to go. And I'd heard about this church. And when I was sitting there in that pew and I looked at the choir, I said to myself, 3/4 of the people in that choir I knew, and they were just sitting there. They were just sitting, and I don't know if they just became immune to this kind of dogma, but it really was transformative for me, because I never went back to that church again. It was such a painful experience. But fortunately, through the years, I've been able to find other places of worship. And this really, again, is an extension of that 11th step, where you're really seeking more spiritual development and growth. And so, long story short, I've been able to find churches that are totally inclusive, that are welcoming. Black churches, okay? Many of them are non-denominational, but they treat one as if they are totally human. And even today, I belong to a church that is probably one of the best experiences that I have. So my 12-step journey and my church experience are synergistic. They complement one another. They don't take the place of one another, because I needed to go through that 12 steps before I was able to understand the role that church could play in my life. Through it all, nothing has been more spiritual for me than the 12 steps. But again, being able to transform from a dope fiend shooting up drugs in an abandoned home to a doctoral degree has been nothing short of a miracle. And so when we talk about the church, particularly the Black church, it's always been a place of refuge, always been a place that we could go to with our issues, with our problems. The Black church was that catalyst in the civil rights movement, where our centrality was focused on. Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, and those leaders had the support and the resources of the Black church. The civil rights movement would have never happened without the Black church. And so most of us who have some kind of issue, some kind of problem, some kind of question, we usually take it to the church. But the church has not always been responsive. Case in point, at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we tried, and that was one of the areas of my focus and expertise. It's also HIV/AIDS. And there were some churches that came on board, and it was a whole process. It's different now, but back in the 80s, it was very tumultuous. And it was a challenge trying to get churches, Black churches, on board, because HIV was decimating and devastating the Black, particularly the Black gay community, and white gays weren't always on board. Racism still was pervasive within the gay community, particularly when it came to dissemination of resources. And so we were sort of left to our own devices. And fortunately, I must say, Black women have really came, in terms of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, have really come to the forefront in terms of support, in terms of inspiration, in terms of providing leadership for our community. So as an institution, as a church, what is it that we can do in terms of helping what now have become a survival mechanism for our community? Like, our community is under siege from multiple forefronts. Substance use disorder, in terms of the COVID-19 epidemic, has just reached another milestone. With quarantine and isolation, relapse rates have gone up tremendously, and it's very problematic within our community. So we have a very, very important role that the church can play. And so, and I want to mention this this particular term that I only learned as a result of attending this conference, and that is the term syndemic. I never heard of it, but our keynote speaker, she so eloquently,
It was awesome, yeah.
and poignantly talked about the impact of, particularly in the African American community, this whole notion of syndemic, where it is a synergistic sort of disease process that is multifaceted for African Americans. So the issue of health disparities, issues of poverty, issues of stress, issues of substance use disorder, and the adverse impact of COVID-19 all culminate synergistically in the African American community to really, really put us in a more desperate kind of situation. So I want to thank her for really opening my eyes, for really looking at this concept in our community. And we all know that in our community, particularly here in Atlanta, COVID-19 is really impacting the African American community more than just about any other community. So what can we do in terms of the church as an institution? So the Department of Health and Human Services really has, I think, a phenomenal kind of what they call a toolkit, where they really look at how churches can begin to be a part of the solution. They can begin to be a part of really going beyond the walls of the church into the community, and even being a part of community-based participatory kinds of activities. Same as what happened with the civil rights movement. We are now in another movement, as a result of the civil rights movement, and we're having more compelling issues now that really the church can really help address. They're sending federal troops into our communities as an occupying force, not as a force of wanting to work collectively with local leaders and trying to provide resources for these communities so they don't have to resort to substance use, so that jobs can be brought into these communities. So individuals who come out of being incarcerated don't have that stigma of felonies on their records where they're not able to make a livelihood. Those kinds of things. No, what we are seeing is an invasion of our communities with federal forces whose only goal is total a kind of oversight and total sort of invasion of our community. So as part of this toolkit, there are several of the important things that I want to bring out that's part of this toolkit. One of the things that they ask, the first three: open your doors, increase awareness, and build capacity. So one of the things that in terms of our meetings, our 12-step meetings, let me just say, most of them are held in churches. They're not affiliated with the church. They're not bound by the religious doctrine or dogma of the church, but the church provides a space for them or for us to hold our meetings. And they don't do it, free of charge. Each one of our groups, as part of our principle and part of what guides us, we pay for our meeting space. We don't pay a whole lot, but nevertheless, we don't want to be aligned with any other kind of organization. But so therefore we pay, $70, $80, $90, $100 a month or whatever it is. And that is through, contributions that are given by our members at every single meeting. So that's one of the ways that the churches can really help is as providing space for those kinds of activities and spaces for other activities, to have education around substance use disorder, education around, vulnerable populations, our seniors, and how we can sort of provide the kinds of programs that can actually help communities, referral programs, so forth. So that's when we talk about opening our doors, that's what we're talking about. Increase awareness, again, increase awareness about what's going on in our communities, increase awareness about the fact that the opioid epidemic and substance use disorder is impacting our communities, but nobody's talking about it. When we say prayers, oftentimes it would help if we even included prayers for those that are suffering from substance use disorder, so that so that person that's sitting out there in the congregation will know that they will be able to go to somebody in that congregation, in that church leadership, and maybe talk about what's really, really going on in their life, and being able to be referred to an organization that can really help them. And the third one, building community capacity. So when we look at opening your doors, there are three salient points here. And I thought this was so powerful. This was a rabbi who says, when I meet a Jewish person who is in active addiction, I do not suggest they go to a synagogue and pray. The first place I'm going to send them is to an appropriate 12-step program. That is just sort of like unheard of. But I think that as more and more churches become aware of substance use disorder and aware of the nature of the disease process, as we talked about it, they will have more of an understanding that it's not to take away from their beliefs or their religions, but oftentimes it's those individuals from 12-step programs who have been through the disease, who can better understand what an individual is going through, where oftentimes churches may not be able to reach them at that particular level. That's not everyone. Some people get clean, never step foot in a 12-step program. Some go directly to church. Some don't go anywhere. I just know most people that I know get clean through a 12-step program, as well as attending other spiritual religious organizations. The other salient point here, you see with this arrow on the right-hand side, churches are not neutral bystanders. What they don't say is just as important as what they do say. So those institutions that are silent about the issues that are affecting the African-American communities are really giving out a very loud message about who they are. And lastly, on this next point, our hope is that as addiction is understood as a treatable chronic medical condition and not a personal or moral thing, prejudice and shame will be replaced by a spirit of compassion and hope that opens doors, hearts, and resources to those suffering with a substance use disorder. That's absolutely powerful and trend-setting in terms of how churches can become involved in the recovery and support process. And building capacity. The most important thing that I want you to get out of this slide is sort of these bullet points, these 4 bullet points of how organizations and churches can be trained. They can be trained to become peer recovery coaches. So those individuals that are in the congregation that are clean, been clean for years, can become recovery coaches. And let me just tell you, one of the most poignant moments where individuals want to change oftentimes is when they go to the hospital, they had an overdose, we put them on mechanical ventilators, and then they've gone through that process and clean themselves out, and we take that tube out of their lungs. That's the time when these recovery coaches become important, because they know they were at death's doorstep and that something saved them. And this can become the time when they make life-saving choices and decisions. The second point, make referrals to treatments, respond to emergency situations. Many of these churches can have naloxone available for parishioners who perhaps have substance use disorder issues. They can perhaps make available to some families these naloxone kits. And lastly, providing ongoing support for those in recovery and living with an addiction. So want to just take a moment. I talked a little bit about this, COVID-19. And because of, we have an issue in terms of our meetings and having to have our recovery meetings on Zoom. But with the COVID-19, it really has impacted rehabs and being able to not socially distance all the time in these rehabs. And oftentimes these outpatient programs are no longer seeing patients. There really becomes challenging for newcomers. We also know that because of sheltering in place and for some people quarantine, alcohol use has increased dramatically. Okay, the whole issue of quarantine, family dynamics may change when you have someone who maybe in the past you didn't even know had a substance problem, but now that they're in the house all the time, now that you're seeing them on a daily basis, you become as a family more aware of their substance use. And also online churches. Most churches now, or many churches now, are doing their services online, and that really has impacted pretty dramatically, outreaches to the community and so forth. And so we have to take into consideration the reality of what's going on in terms of the opioid epidemic, substance use disorder, and COVID-19. And I want to, I think, probably got about 10 more minutes or so, because I want to leave time for questions.
Yeah,
but
we got 5, but
the
break starts at 10:45, I think. Wait, 10.
About 5 more minutes?
Yeah, the break starts at 10:30, and then we start back up at 10:45. So you're good.
Okay, great. So I want to just kind of illuminate this sort of mantra for us, which replaces that old adage that once an addict, always an addict, till we do recover. And this is sort of the thing that we say almost in every single meeting. When at the end of the road, we find that we can no longer function as human beings, either with or without substances, we all face the same dilemma. What is there left to do? There seems to be this alternative. Either we go on as best we can to the bitter ends, jails, institutions, or death, or find a new way to live. And through the 12-step process, as well as a church collectively and synergistically, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people have found a new way to live. And if you ever get a chance to go to a world convention, you will see what I'm talking about. When people come from every corner of the earth in one place and singleness of purpose, and that's celebrating recovery, it is nothing short of a miracle. And I just want to leave you with this. My birthday is July 13th, 1953. And somehow I just believe that this 12-step program was sort of invented for me, because that's the same year that the 12-step program that I go to was sort of started in July of 1953. So I kind of think it was kind of made for me, kind of selfish, but that's kind of how I feel. But it's been a great road. And so with that, we will open up for questions. So I guess I can stop sharing my screen.
You can. That was awesome. I'll give you a virtual clap and a clap. That was awesome. We really appreciate that just testimony, and I mean the whole journey. It was beautiful, as beautiful as our keynote on the first day. So we appreciate that. We did have a couple of questions that came in originally once you got going. The one question was answered by Dr. Kim, and then we had another question that came in from Ms. Dolores. If Ms. Dolores wants to get off mute, she wanted to know, do you all know if anyone who is doing longitudinal research to follow neonatal abstinence syndrome babies?
I actually don't know of individuals who are actually doing longitudinal studies, but I do know a young lady in Atlanta, works at Emory University. She's a colleague of mine who probably is the sort of premier person in terms of neonatal abstinence syndrome. And I would need to go back and look in my emails to really find her name, but I'm leaving my contact information, and anyone can contact me at any time, but I can certainly follow up with you to give you, her name is Karen, I know her first name is Karen, and I just can't think of her last name, but she is the premier person in terms of the neonatal abstinence syndrome. And also I worked for a year, almost a year and a half, with the Georgia Department of Public Health in setting up their statewide opioid strategic plan. And as a result of that plan, one of the things that happened is that they organized a neonatal abstinence syndrome work group. And it's in that work group that these kinds of issues and research processes actually are addressed. So I can also give you that information, because anybody in the community can join this particular work group. There's several work groups, but that's the one that addresses neonatal abstinence syndrome.
Okay, I will definitely reach out to you. I'm a macro social worker with Department of Health and Human Services, and we do a lot of following the states and require them to do a lot of things in this area. So just was trying to get some additional information.
Well, definitely give me a call and I can talk a little bit more about that because, yeah, there's some resources and directions that I can point you to.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Did anyone have any other questions? And I saw a couple of people ask, can you get the presentation? This is one of our plenary sessions, so everyone was registered, just like everyone is registered for any single sessions, such as our keynote as well. So everyone was registered. So everyone, if Dr. Bryant is willing to share, it will go out with the rest of the presentations that presenters were willing to share as well. Everyone will get that at the end with evaluations as well. No evaluations have gone out and no presentations have gone out this time, but they will be available all at once for you. Did anybody else have any questions?
And I'll make sure that I send out the latest version to you, Celine, as well.
Okay. Okay.
I just posted one.
Oh, yeah, she sure did. Dr. Cannon, how do we begin as healthcare professionals the dialogue on racial bias and socioeconomic conditions? And how is this negatively impacting African Americans and brown-skinned people?
Good question. Good question. One of the things that I would recommend is, particularly here in Georgia, our Department of Public Health really has a lot of programs that are available that direct individuals toward community resources, as well as community educational kinds of programs. And so I think that will be a good start, because it is their responsibility, Department of Public Health, to really address these issues and to provide the kind of community resources that will help to promote community awareness and community engagement. And so I would say start there. Also, your health department is the other department that really provides those same kinds of resources and community outreach, just in terms of providing resources for your community. I wish, and what we're working here on in Georgia, that there was a central place, a central location, very similar to what HIV and AIDS had. They had these key contact manuals that anything dealing with HIV and AIDS, you could find right in that book. And they transitioned that to online. I think that the Department of Public Health was working, at least here in Georgia, on a central sort of depository where information, resources related to substance use disorder can be housed in one place, and also making it user-friendly. You shouldn't have to click on 10 different places in order to find one answer. And so that's sort of, some states are in front of us in terms of those efforts. But if something like that exists in your state or your locale, I think that would be great. But in Georgia, we're still sort of